Thanks very much, Jason, and can I thank once again CEDA for the generosity of letting me have the opportunity of at least the first 15-20 minutes of uninterrupted extolling of a budget that I am in fact very proud of. I'd like to pay my respects to the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, and I'd also like to recognise any elders past, present or emerging who may be with us here today. Also, a public service announcement. If there is anybody who seems recently to have missed their mobile phone, I may have stolen it from you and it's on my desk. If you've got my phone, I'd greatly appreciate it back. So, the Victorian budget 21-22 is really being delivered only 6 months after the previous budget. And I think it is very much a different budget. It's a budget that shows that this government is capable of a level of nuance and focus that I've got to say even I have been somewhat amazed by. The easiest thing in the world is to keep the good times rolling until they end. But the greatest challenge for any government is to make sure that you can allow people to prosper and achieve their full capacity, supported and assisted by the state, and recognising that many need the support and assistance of government, whilst others can be part of the solution and assistance. So if 2020 was defined by fear and anxiety, this year really is defined by the relief and joy of normal life resuming. There's a new sense of freedom that I think is liberating us all as we leave our house without masks, except when you're travelling on public transport or you can't appropriately socially distance. We meet with friends and, of course, we plan a holiday. When the crisis of our lifetimes hit, Victorians rose in ways that surprised, I think, even each and every one of us. We really looked after each other. It might feel like that time has passed, that is the time of greater generosity and sense of community, but it hasn't. In fact, the challenges we now confront are profound and they will define us. It's not often that you can have the satisfaction of seeing exactly what this community did in a way that no other community anywhere in the world has been able to do, and that is to find the focus of purpose to defeat a second wave of a pandemic. We heard so many people tell us during the course of this that the strategy was wrong and we had to give up and open up. And imagine where we'd be today if, as a community, we'd succumb to those calls. But it is vitally important that we don't lose the opportunity that this newfound sense of common purpose and destiny provides for us. And that's exactly what this budget is about. Perhaps it's not as robust in its generosity in terms of its provision, coming only 6 months after the biggest spending budget the state has ever seen, some $49 billion in the November budget of new expenditure. What we're now doing is recognising that there are areas of disadvantage and opportunity we need to take, and we need to make decisions as a community about the value and appropriateness of those interventions. Because quite frankly, it isn't all over until it's all over for all of us, and there are still so many in our community who are doing it tough. And we need a long-term strategy to help all Victorians recover. But that means not only supporting people in the short term, but actually investing in their future as well. This budget will drive our state's recovery by focusing on the fundamentals, by supporting those still struggling, by delivering care where it's needed most, and supporting thousands of jobs at the same time. Now, that includes building a new mental health system from the ground up. Not trying to apologise and nuance and intricately manage the system as it stands at the moment, but to recognise it's failed. And we have a mental health crisis of unprecedented proportions. Governments that try to find somebody else to blame or somebody else to take responsibility for the problem will never be part of the solution. So we have to accept what we've done to date has not worked, and what we have to do is find a way to make the system work. So this budget will drive our state's recovery by focusing on the fundamentals, by supporting, of course, those still struggling, by delivering care where it's needed most. We'll support thousands of jobs at the same time. And that, of course, includes the mental health system that we'll build from the ground up. It invests in more of the services and the support that Victorians need, helping our hospitals, our health system recover, ensuring a bright future for our kids, and delivering the road and the rail that our state needs, and investing in strong, connected communities. The investments made in this budget will support an average of 38,000 jobs every year over the next 4 years. But before we look closer at the spending priorities in this budget, I really wanted to first go over the current state of the Victorian economy. And I'm speaking to a room full of economists after all, and I'm sure you'll correct me if you think my optimism, which is not a natural trait that comes to me, if you ever have a drink with me, I start getting a bit depressed about halfway through the drink, realising that it's almost empty. But I'm starting to see a glass half full when I look at our economy, and certainly its performance is giving us every indication that there is massive improvement going on. So our recovery, of course, is well underway, and the outlook for the economy is positive. Business and consumer confidence are elevated. Household balance sheets in aggregate are strong, and monetary policy remains highly supportive. Victorian GSP is forecast to increase by 6.5% in 21-22, and this follows an estimated fall of about 2% in 2021 and a decline of 0.5% in 19-20 due to the impacts of the coronavirus pandemic, particularly on the June quarter 2020. With the restrictions being eased through the latter part of 2020, activity and employment rebounded strongly in the December quarter in a way that not even I, in my wildest optimism, could have assumed. By March 2021, employment had recovered to pre-pandemic levels. In fact, figures out yesterday show that Victoria now has about 18,000 more jobs than we had in February last year. Our employment workforce is larger than pre-pandemic. You look at New South Wales, that's not the case. Amazingly, they continue to have a lower employment workforce than pre-pandemic. So, looking at the jobs plan, we announced as part of the 2021 budget, including a target to create 400,000 jobs by 2025, with half of these by 2022. Once again, my pessimism has come back to haunt me because, as you'd appreciate, we've done appreciably better than that. There were some who thought that a strong bounce back might be out of reach, and I'm really thrilled to see the performance of the Victorian economy has proven so many of us wrong, including me. The strength of the Victorian economic recovery means that the interim targets has already been met. We said we'd create 200,000 jobs by the end of 2022. As of yesterday, according to the ABS, we've got 243,000 jobs, with that many people finding jobs since September, which was a low point in the economic cycle during the pandemic. So looking forward, employment is forecast to grow by 2.5% in 21-22, more than just figures on a screen. Let me tell you, this means more people in jobs securing better futures for themselves and for their families, and that's the focus of this government, letting every Victorian achieve their full potential. Unfortunately, of course, the pandemic hit some cohorts worse than others. Women and young workers were more likely to work in industries most affected during the pandemic, such as accommodation and food services. Women were also more likely to take on caring responsibilities in 2020 when children were required to remote learn, and obviously that put an enormous pressure both upon the household but also upon principally women's capacity to earn. But encouragingly, the employment recovery has been strong for women and young people. Employment among women has rebounded to pre-pandemic levels, despite women being disproportionately affected by job losses in 2020. Similarly, proportions of young people in employment have now recovered to around pre-coronavirus levels. So, of course, Victoria's strong economic rebound is a culmination of enormous effort from business and organisations from across sectors fighting hard to not only stay afloat, but in many ways to transform and to grow. But as I said earlier, the choices that the Victorian government made to support industry survival, invest in infrastructure, to spur job creation, and to invest in the services that both deliver community value and provide jobs have cushioned the economic blow of the pandemic. Through the Jobs Plan, announced as part of the 2021 November budget, the Victorian government did two things. Firstly, we directly targeted support to those hit hardest by the pandemic to support them to get back on their feet. And secondly, we played to our strengths by investing in high-growth industries in areas of comparative advantage. Key Jobs Plans initiatives are well underway, creating jobs and setting up the economy of the future. Last year, we outlined a comprehensive and deliberative fiscal strategy focused on the medium term. We've made some good progress on step one. We're reducing unemployment and restoring economic growth. And in fact, I think it probably warrants a tick in that box. With this budget, we're ensuring that we don't take the foot off the pedal. Our forward estimates also show that we're on our way to achieving step two in the fiscal repair strategy, and that is delivering an operating cash surplus of $1.1 billion, which is now forecast for 22-23. Net debt is projected to be $156.3 billion by June 2025, lower in each year of the forward estimates than forecast in last year's November budget. Indeed, if you do the cumulative account of what the reduction in the net debt is over our forward estimates, you'll find that there is some $46.2 billion worth of debt that is now reduced from what we saw as being the likely cumulative responsibility over the budget and forward estimates as recently as November. Similarly, if you looked at our deficit numbers, you'll find over the budget and forward estimates figures, our position has improved by $14.1 billion. But there's still plenty of work that we have to do. With strong, balanced and responsible financial management, we are securing, collectively, our state's recovery. Even more importantly, we're securing our people's recovery as well. So, from a debt perspective, the impacts of this event on Victorian debt position should be considered in the context of how Victoria's fiscal position changed in response to other notable events over the past century. While debt's increased over the past decade, primarily as a result of infrastructure investment and the pandemic, the increase is still moderate relative to debt incurred in varying circumstances across earlier decades. So, as you'd appreciate, low debt has really been a phenomenon of the 2000 and going forward period. Yes, we are increasing our debt profile, but in historical terms, we are profoundly lower than most of the previous century. So the increase in debt is manageable as current low interest rates mean that interest expenses as a proportion of total debt revenue or budget revenue is much lower than previous peaks. Reserve Bank of Australia has indicated that interest rates are expected to remain low for an extended period, and I'm taking the Governor at his word, and that of course will assist us enormously in being able to rebuild the economy. That means that interest expenses as a proportion of revenue is forecast to remain at moderate levels by historical standards. To put that into some context, in the November budget, I indicated that our debt profile was going to require, from an own source revenue sense, about a 4.4 cents in the dollar expenditure. That's out of our own source revenue. That had increased from 3.3 cents in the dollar. In this budget, the number's closer to 4.7 cents in the dollar. We're seeing just at the margin, interest rates starting to push up a little bit. And as you'd appreciate, 4.7 cents in a dollar, I think, is eminently manageable and enables us to make choices that otherwise we couldn't if we didn't have the access to the debt facilities we've applied. And from a debt to GSP ratio perspective, Victoria's position is clearly manageable. Net debt is projected to be $102.1 billion by June 2022, and it's forecast to increase to $156.3 billion by June 2025. So as a proportion of gross state product, net debt is projected to increase to 26.8% by June 2025. And as you can see, this continues to be much lower than the Commonwealth's own net debt to GDP ratio as a hurdle towards $1 trillion worth of debt. Approximately half of all Victorians will experience poor mental health in their lifetime. Yet, for far too long, that suffering in the community just hasn't been taken seriously enough, and certainly not seriously enough from governments. Yet it's been well established by the Royal Commission into Victoria's mental health system, and it's why we're delivering the biggest social reform of a generation. This is a problem that can no longer be swept under the carpet or avoided, something that you don't talk about because it's not polite. It's incumbent upon us all now to recognise that this is a problem that has to be exposed to the daylight of scrutiny. So whilst you might think the cost of fixing the system is too great, the cost of not doing anything, of course, not fixing it, is far greater. Last budget, we provided $869 million, then the single biggest investment in mental health Victoria has ever seen, to start the work of fixing our mental health system. Now we're delivering a record $3.8 billion investment to truly transform the way that mental health and wellbeing support is offered in our state. Together, these investments will support 3,000 new jobs. $954 million will go towards establishing 22 reformed area mental health and wellbeing services to replace the current services. $370 million will go towards improving access to mental health beds and better acute care for Victorians living with mental illness. Fixing our mental health system will take time, there's no doubt about that. And the sum total of these investments is a significant next step in delivering on the recommendations of the Royal Commission. But let's not delude ourselves. This is not the solution. This is not the end of the interventions that governments will have to make. We're going to have to attend to this as a very substantial and serious problem going forward each and every year for many years to come. So ensuring that we protect the long-term future of the funding, just as the Royal Commission into Mental Health recommended, we need to demonstrate that longevity of effort and focus. A new dedicated measure will be put in place and has been included in this year's budget in accordance with the recommendations of the Royal Commission. The Mental Health and Wellbeing Levy will apply to businesses with wages paid in Victoria by businesses with more than $10 million in wages nationally from the 1st of July 2022. We're making sure that every dollar of investment is doing double duty, supporting Victorians in need and good, stable jobs for Victorians. And it's a fundamental philosophy that underpins the way that this budget is being employed. We want to make sure that not only do we get the policy right, the appropriate intervention that gives us a good policy outcome, and in this case mental health, but we also get the economic enablement of employment into the community. So the double duty that I'll talk about quite a bit during the course of the sell of this budget. Building on our $1.4 billion investment last year, this budget provides $1.2 billion to protect our children and keep vulnerable families together. Not only will these investments improve the lives of children and families around Victoria, they'll also support something like 1,000 jobs across our state. A further $354 million is being provided to support victim survivors, and address family violence, and continue implementing the recommendations from the Royal Commission into family violence. $194 million will go towards homelessness services, focusing on people who need help in the rental market, young people leaving care, and vulnerable Victorians with complex needs. Over the past 6 years, the Andrews Labor government has delivered $21.6 billion to give our kids a quality education. This year's budget invests a total of $3.5 billion in education, helping to make sure that every child gets a great start in life. Key investments that we've delivered in this budget: $1.6 billion to deliver new schools and upgrades of existing schools. As the member for Werribee, a big shout out to the Acting Premier and Education Minister. I'm a large beneficiary of that. $277 million to deliver a comprehensive range of reforms to put student health, mental health and wellbeing at the centre of school communities. $185 million to support our teaching workforce and to give them the recognition and the skills that they will need as we're putting a greater onus upon them in terms of interventions into the broader social concerns and the problems that young people confront. $167 million to continue the rollout of three-year-old kinder, and I'm really pleased to say that as a consequence of this investment in the budget, every local government area in the state will have access to three-year-old kinder. As we continue to recover from the pandemic, this budget delivers $7.1 billion to continue to improve our hospitals and our healthcare system. $3.7 billion in funding will help meet demand for hospital services, including more emergency department staff, extra highly specialised therapies and support for new wards as they open. There's a further $1.3 billion to continue our public health response to COVID and backing the ongoing efforts of our contract tracers and public health team, while also supporting Victoria's rollout of the vaccine program managed by the national government. To help alleviate the pressure on our emergency departments, the budget will deliver more than $759 million in funding for more paramedics, more triage care and support staff for Ambulance Victoria, as well as targeted funding to improve the flow of patients in our busy emergency departments. Community-based health services will receive a $91 million boost, including help to catch up on treatments that Victorians have deferred during the pandemic, like public dental, cancer diagnoses and screening, and maternal and child health. And $50 million will support the establishment of Victoria's capability to manufacture mRNA vaccines, but let me assure you that will only be the start of that contribution. We expect, of course, to get to full manufacturing capacity, we'll need to make a more substantial investment than that. So true to the government's form, we're continuing to invest in Victoria's big build, with government infrastructure investment expected to average $22.5 billion a year over the budget and forward estimates. Now that includes new expenditure in rolling stock, mental health facilities and schools, funding already committed on major productivity enhancing projects which include North East Link, Metro Tunnel, Westgate Tunnel, Melbourne Airport Rail and the removal of 75 level crossings by 2025. Road and rail, of course, is a big part of this average, some $22.5 billion a year in spend. This year's budget provides $2.3 billion for our rail network, including $986 million to build 25 brand new Extrapolis 2.0 trains and supporting infrastructure for our metropolitan network. $242 million will go towards the next steps towards Turn Up and Go services by upgrading the tracks near Caulfield Station, enabling more trains and more frequent services. $265 million will go towards improving our road network, including $95 million to upgrade and to maintain our suburban and regional roads, and $42 million will go towards a fairer and more productive road network for freight, and $21 million will go to improving the safety and access of our walking and cycling tracks. Regional communities underpin Victoria's economy and our state's prosperity. They're incredibly diverse, from dryland farming to irrigated agriculture, from tourism to new energy and advanced manufacturing, from big cities to small towns, from schools to hospitals, road and rail. We've strengthened our economy by ensuring that no community and no Victorian is left behind. And we're investing $3.7 billion to support economies to get back on track by creating jobs all over Victoria. Last budget, only November, we put something like $8 billion into regional communities. I know sometimes you have to build on your previous effort, but I've got to tell you, this budget is not the story of building on what was the single biggest infrastructure and investment program the state has ever seen. This is about consolidating the opportunities of that. But it's close to $30 billion of investment that we put into regional Victoria since the government came to office. Or put another way, four times what the previous government invested in regional and rural Victoria. Now, it's true, we've been in government 50% longer than they were in government for, but then there's a difference between 50% and 400%. I'm pretty sure the economists in this room would agree. What it does demonstrate is we put a much greater effort and emphasis into making sure that fairness is written into the way that the government's investment structure is spread demographically and geographically across our state. Ultimately, the challenge, the test for Victorians is how fair is this as a budget, and does it enable opportunity for all, as well as encouraging economic growth? So the scale of investment we're making in key areas is made clear if we do a compare the pair with the Commonwealth. My favourite line. You might have noticed I still suffer from a little bit of angst around my relationship with the Commonwealth, but I am undergoing therapy and things are looking good. In this budget, we're investing $3.8 billion to tackle mental illness, compared with the $2.3 billion that the federal government is spending across the nation. The federal government talks about a $110 billion 10-year infrastructure pipeline across the nation. Here in Victoria, we have $144 billion of projects commencing or underway right now. You can see how sometimes I do get a little bit underwhelmed when people fixate about what the federal government is going to do. We're investing $7.1 billion in new infrastructure projects, compared to the $3.4 billion that the Commonwealth announced, of which only about $400 million was in their forward estimates. Once again, a budget of smoke and mirrors. Nothing like taking a bow when you're warming up for the main act, but that's what we tend to see with our federal colleagues. So we're making a record $448 million investment in our First People, including nearly $100 million to progress treaty and self-determination. In contrast, there is no funding whatsoever from the federal government. Following this year's funding allocations, our total funding to address family violence and support victim survivors sits at around $3.5 billion. That's more funding than every single other government in Australia combined, including the Commonwealth. And we're doing all of this whilst charting a clear path of fiscal repair so that we can keep funding the services and the infrastructure that Victorians need. So before I conclude, it's a bit of a tradition of mine. I encourage everybody to donate to Kids Undercover. Yes, I have donated myself. No, it is not public funds, but it is a great opportunity, really, for us to think about those who are not doing as well as ourselves, particularly the journey we've all been through. So as you'd appreciate, this is a very worthy charity, providing housing and support for those kids who might otherwise fall into homelessness. So I'll finish there. There are many more initiatives that I haven't mentioned that really will contribute immeasurably to the wellbeing and the development of Victoria. As we deliver these investments, we'll be creating tens of thousands of new jobs, and with it, a bright future for tens of thousands of Victorian families. It's a pretty simple idea that's at the heart of this budget, ensuring every dollar of investment is delivering a double benefit, making our state stronger and fairer, and getting more Victorians back to work to make it happen. That's been our record in the past 6 years, and that approach will be what drives our recovery. This budget invests in the plan and the projects that Victorians need and that we need to help deliver it. So with this budget, we're creating jobs and we're caring for Victorians. Thank you very much.
Well, Treasurer, thank you very much for sharing your thoughts and outlining the latest budget that will support Victorian families and create jobs and build upon the state's economic recovery. It's time for questions now. So can I encourage everyone in the audience, if you do have a question, please raise your hand. Someone from the CEDA team will come over and bring you a microphone. We've got people roving around. If you do have a question, can I ask you to state your name, the organisation that you're from, and can I encourage we do keep it to questions and not statements as well. So I'm going to kick off, first of all, Treasurer. You know, we all sit here and see the final product of a budget that you delivered yesterday that's hundreds of pages long, and I'm sure there are thousands of pages of spreadsheets that sit behind that enormous piece of work.
Read them all, Jason.
We're about to test that, Treasurer. So page 375, the second half of budget paper 2. The money you're spending on bike paths, no. So Treasurer,
$20 million.
Do we see any rise on that? Treasurer, how do you start, taking a step back, perhaps share a little bit of an insight, how do you start to frame a budget? How do you keep it on track, and how do you start that managing the competing interests to produce the outcome that you do on a 12-monthly basis?
Well, I have an incredible department. I think we're very lucky in this state. The quality of the public servants we have are first rate. But I also have an outstanding group of political advisors who assist me in being able to frame a budget. The hardest part of any budget is to set out what constitute your fiscal strategy. And we pretty much well landed that in the context of the last budget, the November budget, which was that 4-step plan that we unveiled in that budget at the same time that we were spending a considerable amount of money. But it was effectively that we would grow the economy and create jobs, that we would effectively deliver a cash operating surplus for the state. The third step would be that we would deliver an operating surplus, and the fourth step would be that we would then stabilise debt. So we've ticked off, I think, on step 1, growing the economy, creating jobs. Still work to do, but that's well underway. We've identified the pathway out to operating surplus, cash operating surplus, and that will occur in next year's budget. And then progressively, probably in the next period of forward estimates would be my guess, we'll probably hit an operating surplus. And then, of course, once you've got to a point where you've stabilised your budgetary settings, debt will invariably start to come back down.
And how do you manage those competing interests, Treasurer? I mean, I'm sure there are people knocking on your door as the budget's being constructed, very good, worthy ideas and demands. How do you manage that? How do you balance a budget in a broader sense, not just purely in the numbers sense, but on the competing interests?
It's a really good question, Jason, and there's no easy answer to it. We obviously get all of the bids that ministers produce, and they produce some fantastic ideas, I've got to tell you. I think I did a quick calculation. It would have been close to $90 billion worth of new expenditure if I'd have agreed to all of the proposals. And you sort of feel frustrated for them because you know that in amongst that there are some brilliant ideas. But of course we can only spend what we've got a capacity to manage in a budgetary setting. So we, as an expenditure review committee, which the acting Premier of course, chaired in the absence of the Premier, we go through those bids and collectively try to form a view about where our priorities are. And from a government, it was relatively easy in this budget. Like, mental health had to be at the centre of our priorities, given the obligations that the Mental Health Royal Commission had placed upon us, quite rightly, might I say. So mental health went straight to the front of the queue, but unfinished business around ensuring that we get people back into work, continuing our capital works program, making sure that the transition from a pandemic and closed economy to a fully functioning and robust economy where people were able to make the transfer to the jobs that we saw as the potential for growth, they had to be prioritised as well. And ultimately it comes down to completing the work around domestic violence and the work that we committed to there. So assuring that we were creating jobs but also protecting the well-being of the community were underlying the priorities of this budget.
And just on that mental health, mental well-being levy, absolutely applaud you for the work that the government has done in recognising the challenges that always existed, I think, in the community. We know they existed and were only compounded by the challenges that we've gone through in the last 15 months. You're spending $3.8 billion, I think, across the forward estimates on it, but to support that is the mental health and wellbeing levy. How does that interact with your objective of creating jobs?
Well, I think it ultimately does. If you look at what the Royal Commission into Mental Health said, they made the observation that mental health, because it's being effectively so poorly managed at the moment right across our state, might I say our nation, that it costs about $14 billion of economic opportunity. To business, it's about $1.9 billion a year. And that's as a consequence of lower workplace productivity, absenteeism, and injuries at work. So this is an inescapable process of accounting for what is a very substantial social deficit and, might I say, an economic imperative. We've got to get this right. And yes, nobody likes paying extra taxes. I absolutely understand that. But if you look at the tax as we've structured it, if you're a business in New South Wales, from the 1st of July next year, you'll be paying 5.45% payroll tax. In this state at the moment, it's 4.85%. So there is room for adjustment, and the comparative employment costs are, I would argue, substantially better in this state, whether it's the costs that you might outlay for the purposes of purchasing property. The median price of a property here in Victoria is considerably lower than, or here in Melbourne is considerably lower than Sydney. And as I made the point, our employment market is running so much better than New South Wales is at the moment. Whilst our headline unemployment rate, we're both at about 5.5%, we've got about 1.2% better participation rate in our labour market at the moment. And New South Wales have actually lost jobs since the pandemic, whilst Victoria has actually put on jobs since the start of the pandemic. So our labour market is functioning much better. To keep that economic opportunity growing, we have to look at one of the greatest retardants of economic opportunity, and that's mental health.
Treasurer, I'm a banker at heart. Now, you've had your therapy to deal with your issues with the feds. I've had therapy to be able to admit that in a public forum, that I'm a banker. When I look at the budget, I do look at the debt numbers, and I look at the net debt to GSP, and I look at the gross debt number across the forward estimates. Why shouldn't I be concerned?
Well, I suppose the first thing is, if we didn't have a fiscal strategy underpinning what we're doing, you'd have every right to be concerned. I mean, I come from a government that's prided itself on its managing its debt profile and using its balance sheet effectively to leverage economic opportunity for this state. I can remember being Chief of Staff to Steve Braxton at one stage in 2001, 2002, we were seriously contemplating whether we wanted to pay off all the state's debt. That's how close we were to zero. Look, the times have changed, and as John Maynard Keynes once said, when the facts change, I change my conclusions. And quite frankly, if we tried to operate in a fiscal austerity mode at the time that the community and the economy was at greatest risk, I think we would have done immeasurable damage to the economy. And like people like to talk about, well, why did we have a second wave? Well, that's a debate that is legitimate, and the community will ultimately form their own judgment about what went on and who reacted best. But the more substantial issue I think we need to come to grips with is, if you look around the nation, despite the fact that we've been through this enormous trial collectively as a community, our economy is a standout performer in the nation. And why is that? I think we've found a newfound sense of common purpose and resilience as an economy. So certainly, from my perspective, I think we do need to have those fiscal parameters. We also do need to change to the shifting circumstances of the time. You will see a dramatic change from the November budget, when it was putting money out the door as best I could to support the community and to grow the economy under our jobs plan. This budget, it's been a lot more focused where the investment goes, and it's been particularly focused around how we wind back our recurrent expenditure profile. So in this year's budget, we've identified about a 9%, slightly higher 9% spending on employee expenses. That's due to the fact that we're employing a lot of contract tracers, we're employing a lot of community support services, whether it's hospitals, ambulance, you name it. We're trying to ramp up the embedded long-term demands that the community has. But look forward, after we put in place the wind back of expenditure in the public sector, $2.7 billion worth of savings being made there, a winding back of our wages policy. Essentially, we expect that we'll have about 2.5% growth in employee expenses going forward. And it hasn't been easy. Like, we've had to sit down and talk to ministers, to secretaries of departments, to unions about the need to just wind this back now that we've attended to the immediate crisis.
If you do have a question, please do encourage you to put up your hand. As I said, someone from the CEDA staff will come and give you a microphone. Yes, we've got a question over here. Otherwise, I'm quite happy to continue the conversation between myself and the Treasurer, but over to you.
Thank you, Jason. Thank you, Treasurer. My name is Helen Sui. I'm Chief Executive Officer, Moonee Valley City Council. Congratulations, Treasurer, for delivering another successful state budget. For the range of initiatives, I can see the local government can play important roles in partnership with the state, whether it's mental health or kinder rollout, or the infrastructure delivery or the pipelines. So my question is, what is the best approach for me as a council CEO to seek those partnership opportunities? Thank you.
Well, I keep playing with this thing. I'm going to break it eventually. Sorry about that. Thanks very much for the question. I suppose the first thing I'd say is recognising that we do see a genuine partnership with local government, whether it's on the rollout of our 3-year-old kinder, or whether it's the continuing effort that we are going to need to put into community resilience and restitution of the circumstances that they've confronted. We've got programs like the Growing Suburbs Fund that we put in place, again, partnerships with local government. Local government bids, they identify what they intend putting into those projects, and the state puts in an amount as well. And what I've been really pleased to see out of that fund, which I think's got $50 million in this year's budget, is that we've been able to leverage multiple tiers of investment from local government. So generally, we put in $1 and local government will put in $2 and sometimes $3 to those projects. And that's what I call the sort of partnership I like, when somebody else is putting in more money than I am. Don't have that partnership with the federal government much. Sorry, I've digressed again, haven't I? But look, it is important that we recognise that local government have great on-the-ground engagement. Community services, particularly at a time of community distress, will be vitally important. So that partnership is valuable, and it's one that we value and will continue to nurture and grow over the years.
Treasurer, the one thing that I've noticed doesn't seem to have had too much attention over the last 24 hours since you delivered the budget that I saw in the budget papers around the early intervention investment strategy, and I think there's a fund that's attached to it. Could you comment on that a little?
Thank you very much, Jason. This is one of my favourite subjects, and I'm not sure that anybody else gets quite as excited as I do about it, which says a lot about me more than anybody else. But the early intervention investment framework is really about government changing the way that they spend money. Now, we've only got a relatively modest, I think there's half a dozen initiatives that we've identified where we say, let's make an investment upfront and early to, for example, homelessness or kids at risk of falling into the legal and criminal system. Make that investment early and then plot what you expect that you will save in terms of improved performance over the years. It might be over 4 years, but it might be over 8 or 10 years, and then account for those dollars. That is the saving, and put them aside and expect to be able to bank them further down the track. Put in place systems where you can account for them. Because basically what's happening is we're distorting everything to the acute end of our investment framework. Everything is basically trying to put out the fire rather than prevent the fire happening. So an early intervention investment framework, New Zealand have done a bit of work in this space. I think they call it goodwill budget, wellbeing budgeting rather. But we've got a long way to go to get this framework right, to get it accounted for appropriately and effectively, but it will start to put a lot of community welfare and services back into the game, as opposed to the economic interventions that government's always naturally inclined to do, because you can see the money coming back very quickly.
I think we've got a question up the back here.
Thanks very much. Treasurer Pradeep Phillip here from Deloitte. You've outed yourself as a self-confessed pessimist, and by the way, it's not a bad trait for good treasurers. But looking at the budget papers, is that path to surplus too optimistic, and what could derail it? And a follow-up question, not just in Victoria but around the country, private investment is still flagging. What are some of the things we could do to stimulate that to sustain the economy going forward?
Thanks, Pradeep. Well, the first thing, I suppose, what could derail our path to operating cash surplus is all I've been able to identify in, that is the second step of our 4-step fiscal strategy. Anything. The planet could be hit with an asteroid. I haven't taken that into account, I've got to tell you, but there's plenty of things that forecasts don't model, don't predict, and therefore I've often said that the one thing you've got to have is faith in the integrity of the forecasting that you're relying on. And that's why I'm so critical. Oh no, the federal government, I'm back on them again. They don't actually subject their forecasts to any external rigour before they produce their budget. So all they do is, it's a profession of faith. It's a political statement rather than a serious economic and accounting statement. So we, of course, in this state have by law a requirement that the Auditor General has to sign off on the forecast assessments that we're making. So there's plenty of things that can derail our forecasts, and that would only put me into a downward spiral of introspection and depression about what could go wrong. The good news for us, I think, is that we've got every reason to be optimistic about the future. Even I am becoming optimistic about the future, given the signs of growth in the economy and the labour market. Certainly from my perspective, I think governments need to be prepared to adjust the trim of the sail in terms of the way that they're budgeting. So we were basically hoisting the spinnaker basically during the, I don't know why I've done a sailing analogy, I know nothing about sailing, but we were going at speed, as you'd appreciate, and now we've had to sort of wind that back a bit because you just can't keep running furiously, particularly if you're in a marathon, and that's what getting out of this economic event will be. Just the issue of investment, what can government do to facilitate investment? Well, the most obvious thing is to engender a sense of optimism, and optimism that is fact-based, I suppose, making sure that business have some assessment that this government is has a clear vision about where they want to go, can give clear road signs around the investment that we intend making, and try and put in place better partnerships with business. I think if you look at our $144 billion infrastructure spend that's going on at the moment, there's been a bit of learning as we've gone through this. Can I tell you, we're very good at delivering level crossing removals now that we've delivered 46 of them. But we weren't that good in the first couple. And as in governance, the same with life. You get better as you go along. And we are well and truly on top of how you deliver level crossing removals. Often when you're doing bespoke infrastructure, we've assumed that all the risk should sit on the private sector. I think we're going to have to, for these mega projects that government are now entering into, we have to have a much more flexible approach towards risk allocation, and of course that will, I hope, engender a greater degree of optimism and investment from the private sector going forward.
I think we had a question here in the middle.
Hi Treasurer, Jenny Roach from KPMG. Congratulations on such a community-oriented budget. Important to community is also the small business operators that keep many of our local communities very busy and healthy. How best might small business owners access some of the stimulus you've described?
Well, I suppose the first thing that we'd say to small businesses is that this budget has been very much focused on first doing no harm, the surgeon's credo, as it were. We have, let's be honest and unashamed about it, we've identified where in this economic event there has been a substantial wealth creation event, and we know when interest rates are low, asset values spike. And we're seeing property prices in Victoria increase to the tune of, well, CoreLogic are assessing a 13% increase in residential housing values over the next 12 months. If you think about that, I'm proposing that we put maybe $2,000 extra on stamp duty for a property at $2.2 million. So instead of over that 12-month period, you'd see a $220,000 appreciation in value. Yes, we'll ask to take about $2,000 out of that appreciation in value if the proposal was to sell it or to purchase a property of comparable value elsewhere. So in practical terms, what we're trying to do is put the burden of the increasing level of services that the state sees as being a necessary part of our social and economic rejuvenation, where it can best be born. Secondly, that means that we've taken a very distinct and clear view that small and medium-sized businesses need to be exempt from a substantial amount of that burden. Certainly from our perspective, we also identify that there are some parts of the community that will need continuing support and assistance from the government. the $100 million partnership arrangement with, in fact, it's 200 million, 100 from the City of Melbourne and 100 million from the state over the next 2 years for inner city CBD rejuvenation and all the challenges that they're confronting. We'll have more to say about access to those initiatives as we go forward. But on top of that, we recognise that some inner city apartment developers are in serious trouble, largely for no reason or fault of their own. They've seen the CBD depopulated, no students, no international visitors. So we've basically said we will reduce the stamp duty costs associated with those properties by 50%, and if they've been on the market, by 100%, in order to try and generate some activity and hopefully some home ownership in that process. We've reduced the payroll tax rate for regional Victoria back down to 1.215%, which is now far and away the lowest payroll tax rate in the nation. But it's about keeping that rejuvenation and growth going on in the nation, and particularly in the fastest growing rural and regional area in the country, and that's rural and regional Victoria at the moment. So identifying the interventions we can make and recognising that there are opportunities for us to make those interventions, I think is vitally important. In terms of grant and program management, Department of Jobs, Precincts and Regions are very much in the business of program development. If you're a distiller, somebody very close to my heart, particularly recently, you'll be able to access the state's $5 million distillery door incentive programs that will effectively allow an industry that is nascent at the moment but growing quickly and needs to grow. We've got some competition right across the country, particularly from Tasmania. I mean, what an injustice. Tasmania are beating us in this. So there will be more grant programs that we'll be putting out into the public domain to reflect the priorities incorporated within the budget.
One last quick question from the audience, otherwise, do we have another one? Otherwise I'll ask my last ones. I think we've got one, was it one up the back there? Yep.
Treasurer, it's Nick Maher from Newgate. Look, thank you very much for the insights into obviously what was a very complex and challenging budget to deliver in this environment. But look, just one question I'd ask about the mental health levy. Considering probably that obviously Victoria mental health issues are not unique to Victoria, would you anticipate, and I know you can't answer for other state governments, but would you still anticipate that other state governments may follow the example of Victoria and introduce their own levies as well?
Well, I can't really talk for other state governments. I think we'll have to wait to see. Their budgets aren't too far behind us, so we'll have to wait to see exactly how they propose to deal with it. I think they are a fair way behind us in terms of an understanding and appreciation of the problem. We, of course, were informed by the Royal Commission and its 65 recommendations that we're now on a bound really to implement. A lot of the other jurisdictions haven't gone through that journey yet necessarily, but the problems are just as profound in all those jurisdictions, make no mistake. We did have some engagement with the Commonwealth. We thought it might be better if we saw the charging being incorporated into, say, a Medicare levy rate, given that this is a national problem. But they had very little inclination in that regard, so we were left once again to our own devices. I expect that you will see, because of the dramatic nature of the problem that was in all its graphic detail spelled out by the Royal Commission, I expect you will see a lot more policy focus coming out of other states. Whether they respond with a levy or they seek to pay for it out of their recurrent capacity, I don't know. But the simple answer I would put in justification of a levy is government's attitude, their emphasis, their focus, it changes very quickly over time. So you need to have some way of assuring an industry that has to commit to decades worth of work that they're going to get the revenue stream to be able to deal with the challenge that confronts them and that government has asked them to address. That's why a levy dedicated to addressing the problems identified by the Royal Commission is so vitally important. Without it, in practical terms, what we're saying is we know what the problem is, we know how to fund it, we're just not interested in doing it because the political discomfort associated with a levy is something that we're not prepared to bear. And quite frankly, any politician that squibs it on that basis is simply part of the problem, not part of the solution.
So thank you for that, Treasurer. As we're almost out of time. A couple of really quick fire questions for you, right? The old adage about never let a good crisis go to waste. The pandemic has been a bit of a crisis. What's the one thing we've been able to take advantage of in a positive sense that's come out of that?
Oh, lots of things, I think. I now know how to operate a computer.
Good.
I'd actually prided myself on never having a computer on my desk. Not that I didn't sort of know the fundamentals, it's just that I knew that if something went wrong, you turned it off and then you turn it back on again.
Reboot in the absence of anything else, yes.
But I wasn't particularly good at it. But what I found is that the things that we didn't think we could do were really just things that we couldn't be bothered trying. So the interconnectedness I've seen in workplaces in the public service, that's profound, and we need to hang on to that. The willingness of the community to have a greater sense of common purpose. And I know I sound a bit flaky when I talk about this stuff because I got quite emotional when I was reading the budget speech yesterday. I don't know if anybody noticed that my voice was quivering from time to time. You noticed? And I thought I'd got away with it. But it really has been quite an emotional and draining time for everybody. And the fact that we as a community have said, look, we can come together and we can do better collectively in terms of how we look after our most disadvantaged. The fact that we've gone out and we housed everybody, every homeless person in the state because of the exposure that they were likely to face due to the pandemic. There was only one thing holding us back previously. Well, two things. A treasurer who didn't like spending money, me, and essentially a solution that was available to us. Now, we haven't fixed that problem, make no mistake. That's why there's considerably more money in this budget, but at least we've started to wrap our arms around the problem, identify the needs that these individuals confront, and try to find a way to best reconnect them into productive society.
And then two really quick ones. I'm going to keep you to 30-second answer for each. This will be a challenge. What keeps you awake at night, and what gets you up excited in the morning to go to work?
What keeps me awake at night is, well, anything that I might have to do with the media, really. It's not that I'm frightened of them, it's just that I genuinely, I am an incredibly boring policy wonk and bean counter, and there's nothing
wrong with being a bean counter. I mean, there's a few accounting firms in the audience and ex-accountants.
We're just not considered a lot of fun, really, Jason. And from my perspective, I'd just like to see a good plan properly executed. And in government, that means coming up with good policy interventions that materially improves the circumstances of the state.
What gets you bounding out of bed, excited, thrilled?
I think every day.
Apart from breakfast.
Every day. Look, I've been treasurer for 7 years now, and it's an incredible honour. I was once asked by a journalist, did I feel resentful about the fact that I was a treasurer having to deal with this calamitous onset of the pandemic? And the more I thought about it, I said, well, actually, no, I feel somewhat honoured that I get the opportunity to try and help the community during what is, quite a catastrophic time for us all. But we're finding a way through it. And the fact that I can play a part in that, I feel good.
There you go. There's your glass half full, Treasurer. I think that's a really, really nice way to end the conversation. Thank you very much. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to invite Jim Frith from McConnell Dowell to the stage, who's going to deliver the vote of thanks. Jim?
Thanks, Jason. And isn't it great to be back in person? I echo Melinda's opening remarks. Gee, it's been a long time, and I've really enjoyed this morning, not because of the dry wit of the Treasurer so much, but it's been a really a great event and very informative. So thank you, Jason, for your moderation. Really deft arrange of questions and taking questions from the floor, to Danusha and Westpac for sponsoring today. These events don't happen unless we have sponsorship, and so to Westpac, thank you very much. To Melinda and the CEDA group, I just can't speak highly enough of what I've seen from CEDA over the last 15 months through this crisis. Industry associations are typically reliant on membership and events like this, and we all know that this wasn't possible for a long time. The way CEDA has reshaped itself and remained relevant, and I think improved many aspects of what it does, is a credit to you, Melinda, and your team. So keep up the great work. We're a passionate supporter and member of CEDA, and anyone in the room that isn't, I'd recommend that you look up the website and just see what the membership of CEDA can offer, because it's a really great organisation. So turning to the Treasurer, and I can't speak highly enough of today. It's been really entertaining and informative. I've got a declaration that I'm not an economist either, but I do understand graphs, and your graphs do make sense. Look, I think as part of the construction sector and a company that works not just nationally but internationally, I'd have to say that the Victorian government over the last 5 or 7 years has been a pleasure to work with. They are forward-looking. They are taking a leadership position on the state of the construction sector, and to Tim's point earlier about risk sharing on these larger projects, we are seeing that. Actually, it's not just talk, and not just rhetoric, it's actually happening. I think the broader implication for society in that is that, you know, the industry that I operate in contributes to about 20% of the economy when you add it all together. So a vibrant construction sector is essential to not just Victoria but Australia, and this government's doing great things to ensure that it's a more sustainable industry, and that we as construction companies aren't just building stuff, we're actually providing a better life for the communities in which we work. And that's really important to me as a leader of business, because you know, we all know how important it is to get discretionary effort out of people. If you can't explain to your people that you're providing a better place, then it's hard yards. So having the opportunity to work for the Victorian government, where it's more than just concrete and steel, and it's more about outcomes, is a privilege. So thank you for that, Treasurer. I do challenge some of the jokes the Treasurer makes about the federal government, because another great thing about this government is its pragmatism, and I think where it needs to cooperate with other entities like the federal government and even the New South Wales government, I see that happening. So again, I'll take my hat off to this government for the way they do that. Just one or two words about mental health. I know it's topical and it's a cost, but where I come from is an industry where it's 6 times more likely for us to lose a colleague through suicide than it is through an incident, and that's unsustainable. It's a tragedy in this country. So I'm on board with anything that we can do to improve the state of the mental health and mental wellness situation we have in this state and in this country. I'm not an economist, so I can't put the numbers together to say how we do that, but leadership is where all this starts, and I think what we got from the government yesterday in the budget was just that. So I think that's all I'd like to say, other than to ask you to join me in thanking the Treasurer for his time this morning. It's precious time. He's got a lot of selling to do, but yeah, please join me in thanking the Treasurer.
Well, all that's left for me to do is to close today's event. I did want to just make a couple of just short remarks, if I could. Firstly, Treasurer, when you're sick of your day job, please feel free to come and apply for a job at the IT help desk at CEDA. You've obviously got the skills now after the last 12 months. The Treasurer said something else that reminded me of one final comment I wanted to make. He talked about what's keeping him awake at night, and it's anything to do with the media. I'm just going to be a little bit selfish here, and it reminded me of our senior economist, Gabriella de Souza, who some of you may have seen on Q&A last night. And I saw her yesterday at 11 a.m. on Teams prepping for that, and she was nervous. It was her first time on the show. She's a fantastic member of our team, and she's really been putting herself out there at some cost. If you've seen her, she's obviously Indian by background, and she's really been putting her views out there on immigration, but also what it's like to have the borders closed and the challenging circumstances that she's had to endure. It's very personal for her, but she's been out there using it to support the work that we do at CEDA. And I do just want to acknowledge that she's actually had some feedback that's been pretty terrible and some pretty racist feedback. And I just wanted to highlight her courage, thank her for it, and just say to all of you that if you haven't had a chance to look at Q&A, please do so. We're trying to get more diversity in our voices, and we're trying to support our team in doing that. So I just wanted to say I'm really proud of her, and if you get a chance to have a look at it, please do. If you want to get behind her on social media, we would really appreciate that and support you in doing that. If I then segue to what we're trying to do at CEDA more broadly, we are really trying to lift the quality of our content, really trying to push more meaningful conversations and tackle the really big issues. We've got more events coming up. We're getting our events mojo back, led by Jo and her team, including these wonderful face-to-face events. So hop online at our website, you'll see what we've got in train. We've got a really good State of the Nation coming up, so if you feel like crossing the border into the ACT, there's a great opportunity. But then thank you everyone for being here. Thank you again for your support for CEDA, and I really look forward to seeing you again soon. Have a nice day.